We suffer more in imagination than in reality. Seneca. Fear. It's one of the most powerful forces in human life. It dictates our actions, shapes our decisions, and often holds us back from the things we truly want. We fear failure, rejection, pain, and the unknown. We fear what others might think of us, or that we'll lose what we've worked so hard to gain. Sometimes we even fear success, because it might bring expectations we're not sure we can handle. But what if most of these fears aren't real? What if they're nothing more than shadows cast by our own minds? The Stoics believed that fear, more often than not, is an illusion, something we create, not something that exists on its own. They understood that while some fears are necessary for survival, most of the ones that dominate our thoughts are completely unnecessary. And worse, they can keep us trapped, paralyzed, and unable to fully live. Think about it. How many times in your life have you worried endlessly about something, only to realize later that it wasn't nearly as bad as you imagined? Maybe it was a big test, a job interview, a difficult conversation, or a life-changing decision. Your mind played out every worst-case scenario, making you feel anxious and uncertain. But when the moment finally arrived, it passed, often with far less consequence than you had feared. This is what Seneca meant when he said, "We suffer more in imagination than in reality." The suffering caused by fear is in most cases self-inflicted. It doesn't come from the world, it comes from within us. And that's good news, because it means we have the power to change it. In this video, we're going to explore how the Stoics understood fear, why they believed it to be an illusion, and, most importantly, how we can overcome it using the same techniques they practiced over 2,000 years ago. If fear's ever held you back, or if you've ever felt trapped by your own thoughts, this might just change the way you see it forever. The nature of fear. Fear is a powerful emotion. It's instinctual, primal, and has been hardwired into us for survival. When our ancestors faced wild animals or hostile tribes, fear helped them survive. It prompted them to flee from danger, to fight when necessary, or to freeze when they had no other option. It was the body's alarm system, a mechanism designed to protect us. But here's the problem. In the modern world, most of the fears we experience aren't about actual survival. Think about it. How often do you feel fear in your day-to-day life, and how many of those instances involve immediate physical danger? Instead, fear now stems from the unknown, a difficult conversation with a friend, a looming deadline, an upcoming presentation. These are not life or death situations, yet we often experience fear as though they are. The Stoics understood that fear often arises from what we perceive, our judgments about situations, not from the situation itself. In fact, they argue that it's not the external events that cause fear, but our thoughts about those events. Take a moment and reflect on your own fears. What are they? Are you afraid of public speaking, of failure, of rejection? These fears often revolve around how we think we will be perceived, or what might happen if we don't succeed. But how much of that fear is real, and how much is simply our imagination at work? The Stoics would argue that it's the latter. They believe that fear is often born from our expectations and assumptions, mental constructs we've created to make sense of the world around us. Seneca, in his writings, touches on this idea. He tells us that we suffer more in imagination than in reality. This is crucial because it shows us that the fear we feel in anticipation of something, say an important meeting or a performance, is often far worse than the reality. We imagine the worst-case scenario and then let our minds dwell on it. This constant mental rehearsal of failure only amplifies the fear. Let's dig deeper. Fear is often linked to uncertainty, to the unknown. We fear what we can't control, and in doing so, we imagine disastrous outcomes. This fear of the unknown is universal. We don't know how things will play out, so we instinctively brace ourselves for the worst. But the Stoics remind us that much of life is outside our control. We can't control the future, we can't control how people will react, and we certainly can't control everything that happens to us. However, we can control how we respond to those events. Here's where the Stoic approach differs from how many of us deal with fear today. We often try to avoid fear by avoiding situations that make us uncomfortable, but the Stoics didn't shy away from fear, they faced it head-on. They believe that most fears aren't as threatening as they seem. By training ourselves to face fear, to challenge its power, we can transform it from something paralyzing into something manageable. In a way, fear is like a shadow. It grows larger the more we try to avoid it. But when we confront it, when we examine the reality of what we're afraid of, it shrinks. Fear often loses its grip when we separate it from our mental distortions. It is not the situation itself that causes us distress, it's how we think about it. The Stoics would encourage us to ask ourselves, what's the worst that can happen? And more importantly, can I handle it? When we face fear through the lens of Stoicism, we begin to see that fear is not an external force. It's a product of our thoughts. It's something we can control, challenge, and ultimately overcome by shifting our mindset. The Stoics also recognize that fear often arises from the belief that something is essential to our happiness or well-being. We fear losing our job, our status, our relationships, because we attach our sense of self-worth to them. But the Stoic mindset teaches us that these things, though important, do not define us. The real source of our happiness lies within our own ability to manage our emotions, to cultivate virtue, and to practice wisdom. When we stop placing our happiness in external things, the fear of losing them loses its power. We begin to realize that we have the inner strength to endure hardship and the wisdom to navigate uncertainty. The Stoics showed us that the real danger lies in our attachment to things beyond our control, not the things themselves. The Stoic approach to fear. The Stoic approach to fear is rooted in a deep understanding of human psychology, and it revolves around the idea that our mind is the true source of our suffering, not external events themselves. Fear, according to the Stoics, arises from our judgment and interpretation of events, not from the events themselves. Understanding this distinction is key to freeing ourselves from unnecessary fear. One of the most insightful Stoic philosophers, Marcus Aurelius, wrote extensively on the subject of fear and how to overcome it. In his Meditations, he stated, "If you are distressed by anything external, it is not the thing itself that troubles you, but your judgment about it. And this you have the power to revoke at any moment." In this simple yet profound statement, Marcus highlights a core principle of Stoicism. We have control over our thoughts and judgments. Fear comes from the stories we tell ourselves about potential threats, stories that are often exaggerated or based on false assumptions. The Stoics teach us that, although we cannot control external events, we can control our reaction to them. We can choose how to perceive challenges and how to frame them in our minds. Take, for example, the fear of failure. Many of us fear failure because we imagine it will result in social embarrassment, loss of status, or personal disgrace. But Marcus Aurelius would ask, what are you truly afraid of? If you break it down, failure may not be the catastrophe you envision. It's simply an outcome, one of many possible outcomes. The Stoics suggest that the fear of failure is often rooted not in the event itself, but in our exaggerated judgment of what failure means. Epictetus, another great Stoic philosopher, took this concept even further. He argued that fear, along with other emotions, comes from our attachments to things outside of our control. For instance, we fear losing something we love, our job, a relationship, our health, because we are attached to these things. But Epictetus reminds us that we cannot control the outcome of these attachments. They are part of the natural order, and no amount of fear can alter their course. The key takeaway here is the dichotomy of control, a foundational concept in Stoicism. Epictetus taught that there are things we can control and things we cannot. Fear arises when we confuse the two. We cannot control the actions of others, the weather or the future, but we can control our thoughts, our actions, and our responses to challenges. By focusing on what we can control, we reduce the power of fear over our lives. A practical way to apply this idea is through a technique called cognitive reframing. This involves challenging the beliefs and assumptions that fuel our fear. When faced with a fearful situation, a Stoic would first ask, "What exactly am I afraid of?" Then, they would examine the worst-case scenario and ask, "Is this really as bad as I imagine it to be?" Often, when we break down our fears logically, they lose their power. We realize that the worst outcome isn't as catastrophic as it seemed in our minds, and that we have the tools to cope with it, even if it occurs. Another vital Stoic practice for dealing with fear is negative visualization. This might sound counterintuitive. Why would you want to dwell on the negative? But the Stoics saw it as a way to reduce fear by confronting the worst-case scenario in your imagination before it ever happens. The idea isn't to wallow in negativity, but to prepare yourself mentally by vividly imagining the worst possible outcome. Whether it's losing your job, facing public humiliation, or experiencing illness, you can come to terms with the idea that even if it happens, you can handle it. Seneca, in his letters, urged his followers to practice negative visualization regularly, not because it would necessarily happen, but because it would help them build resilience and reduce the fear of what might come. It trains the mind to be less attached to comfort and security and to embrace the present moment. When you see that you can endure hardship in your mind, it makes actual hardship less terrifying when it arrives. Lastly, the Stoics emphasized voluntary discomfort as a powerful tool to confront fear. By deliberately choosing to face discomfort, we teach ourselves that fear doesn't have to control us. Voluntary discomfort could look like choosing a more difficult path in life for personal growth, sleeping on the floor for a night, enduring cold showers, or even fasting. This practice strengthens our ability to endure life's difficulties because we show ourselves that we can survive without the luxuries and comforts we've become accustomed to. The Stoics believed that the more we expose ourselves to discomfort, the less power fear has over us. We begin to see that our fears often stem from a desire for comfort or convenience, and that we are capable of much more than we think. It's about developing mental toughness and the courage to face challenges head-on without shrinking away from them. In summary, the Stoic approach to fear teaches us that fear is a product of our minds, fueled by our judgments, perceptions, and attachments. By practicing cognitive reframing, applying the dichotomy of control, embracing negative visualization, and voluntarily facing discomfort, we can weaken the grip that fear has on our lives. Fear is not an inherent part of reality. It is simply a lens through which we choose to view the world. When we change that lens, we transform our ability to navigate life's challenges with calmness and courage. Practical exercises to overcome fear. The Stoics didn't just theorize about fear, they actively practiced ways to overcome it. Here are several detailed techniques they used to face and dismantle fear. 1. Negative visualization. One of the most powerful exercises in Stoic philosophy is negative visualization. Seneca and other Stoics would regularly practice imagining the worst-case scenario. The purpose wasn't to dwell on negativity or to manifest bad things, but to strip fear of its power by exposing it to reason. Imagine you're about to give an important presentation. You fear that you'll forget your words or that everyone will judge you harshly. The Stoic practice of negative visualization would have you imagine all of this unfolding, forgetting your speech, stumbling over your words, feeling embarrassed, and even the possibility of rejection. But here's the key. By visualizing this outcome in advance, you remove its power over you. You realize that even if it happens, it's not the end of the world. You'll live through it, and most likely your audience won't even remember the small mistakes you make. In fact, you may learn valuable lessons from the experience. This practice helps you desensitize to fear. You stop thinking of the worst outcome as something catastrophic. Instead, you recognize that you have the resilience to handle adversity, and you're less likely to be paralyzed by fear in the future. The dichotomy of control. One of the core tenets of Stoicism is the concept of the dichotomy of control. The idea that some things are within our control, while others are not. Fear often arises when we focus on what we can't control, how people will perceive us, what the outcome of an event will be, or external circumstances that may be beyond our influence. The Stoics believe that we should only concern ourselves with what is within our control and let go of the rest. This is incredibly freeing when it comes to fear. For example, if you're afraid of failing at something, remember that your ability to control the outcome is limited. You can control your effort, your preparation, and your attitude, but you cannot control other people's reactions or the future. By focusing on what is within your control, you reduce the fear that comes from the unknown. Instead of fearing failure, you can shift your mindset to doing your best, which is something you can control. Once you accept that the outcome is not yours to command, fear loses its hold over you. 3. Voluntary discomfort. A more advanced Stoic practice is voluntary discomfort, which involves intentionally placing yourself in uncomfortable situations to train your mind to detach from the fear of discomfort. The Stoics understood that fear often arises from our unwillingness to endure discomfort. We're afraid of being cold, hungry, tired, or in any kind of physical or emotional discomfort. Voluntary discomfort could take many forms. You might choose to sleep on the floor for a week to get used to physical discomfort. You could practice fasting for a day to challenge your relationship with food and hunger. Or perhaps you take cold showers regularly to desensitize yourself to discomfort and show yourself that you're capable of enduring it. This practice isn't about being extreme or punishing yourself. It's about understanding that discomfort is temporary and that you are capable of handling much more than you think. Every time you face discomfort, you build resilience. You realize that fear is often based on our resistance to discomfort, and once you embrace it, the fear fades. Mindful reflection on past fears. The Stoics believed in reflecting regularly on past fears and how we overcame them. By examining the things that once terrified us, whether it was a challenge at work, a difficult conversation, or a personal struggle, you can recognize patterns and see how much of your fear was ultimately unfounded. You can do this by journaling. Take time each day to write down your fears and how they played out. Did the feared event occur as you imagined? Did the consequences turn out as severe as you expected? How did you handle it, and what did you learn from the experience? Over time, you'll see a pattern. Your fears are rarely as disastrous as you expect. You'll build a sense of confidence, knowing that you've handled past fears and come out stronger on the other side. This reflection helps retrain your mind to respond to future fears with logic and calm, rather than panic. 5. Reframing and cognitive distortions. The Stoics were masters of reframing, the practice of changing the way we view a situation to reduce fear and anxiety. Fear often arises from cognitive distortions, where we exaggerate the negative aspects of a situation or imagine the worst possible outcomes. When you feel fear, stop and question it. Ask yourself, is this fear based on facts or assumptions? Am I blowing this out of proportion? What's the best case scenario? What can I learn from this situation, regardless of the outcome? Reframing is a way of looking at a feared situation through a new lens. Instead of seeing a presentation as a potential disaster, reframe it as an opportunity to grow and share your knowledge. Instead of seeing a difficult conversation as an inevitable confrontation, reframe it as a chance to connect and learn from the other person. The Stoics weren't denying reality, they were simply choosing to view it in a way that empowered them. By reframing our fears, we can shift from a mindset of avoidance to a mindset of action. Daily practice of self-examination. The Stoics were deeply committed to self-reflection. They would ask themselves daily, what did I do well today? What did I struggle with? What fears did I face and how did I react? Fear often thrives when we don't examine it or confront it. By reflecting on our fears every day, we begin to understand why we're afraid and how we can overcome it. Perhaps you fear rejection, but after thinking about it, you realize that your worth doesn't depend on the approval of others. Or maybe you fear failure, but you realize that failure is a natural part of growth. This practice of self-examination helps you build awareness and develop a healthier relationship with fear. It allows you to spot fear as it arises, examine it rationally, and take steps to overcome it. Fear will always be there, but as the Stoics teach us, most of it is an illusion created by our own minds. The next time you feel fear creeping in, remember Seneca's words, "We suffer more in imagination than in reality." Challenge your fears, question them, and most importantly, don't let them control you. Now watch this urgent video on 6 addictions you must eliminate now. It might just change the way you see your daily habits. If you found this video helpful, consider subscribing for more Stoic insights. And let me know in the comments, what's a fear you've overcome by changing your mindset?